Elena stood at the edge of the balcony, her iridescent skin glistening in the low light of Zymeria's dying sun. The sky above, once a vibrant cascade of violet and deep gold, was now tinged with the graying hues of a world on the brink of collapse. Wind howled through the jagged spires of the city, the towering buildings crumbling under years of neglect and warfare. In the distance, faint echoes of explosions rumbled, a reminder that conflict was never far away. Yet none of that mattered to her in this moment. Elena felt numb, her mind focused only on the void where her husband had once been. Rykar was gone. It was as though the universe had ripped him away like a cruel illusion, vanishing into the darkness, leaving her and their young daughter, Lyra, to fend for themselves on this forsaken planet. There had been no final words of comfort, no explanations. Just an empty promise and a lingering sense of betrayal. She had stood at this very spot the day he left, watching his ship disappear into the polluted atmosphere, believing foolishly that he would return for them. But he hadn't. He'd left them to the wolves. Elena's throat tightened as she recalled his last message. It had been brief, cold, devoid of emotion, everything he'd become over the years. The resistance has failed. I cannot stay. You and Lyra must survive without me. Don't follow me. And that was it. No trace, no means of contacting him, no hope of ever understanding why he had chosen to flee. His pursuit of power, once ambitious but noble, had turned him into a shadow of the man she had loved. Now his name felt like poison on her lips. She clenched the railing until her knuckles turned pale, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. There was no time to grieve, not now, not when the world was crumbling around her and her daughter needed her. "Mama," a soft, uncertain voice interrupted her thoughts. Elena turned to see Lyra standing in the doorway, her tiny form bathed in the dim light of their barren home. The child's eyes, large, luminescent, and filled with a sadness far beyond her years, gazed up at her mother with quiet desperation. Even at 5, Lyra was perceptive, far more than Elena had ever been at that age. Her telepathic abilities were already developing, allowing her to sense the emotions of those around her, even when Elena tried her hardest to shield her thoughts. Lyra took a tentative step forward. "Is Papa coming back?" The question was a dagger to Elena's heart. "No, sweet one," she whispered, kneeling to meet her daughter's gaze. She brushed a strand of silvery hair from Lyra's face, trying to offer a reassuring smile. "Papa, he's gone. But I'm here. I'll always be here." Lyra's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, her lower lip trembling. "But why did he leave us?" Elena hesitated, her mind racing for the right words. How could she explain the complexities of betrayal and abandonment to a child so young? How could she make sense of Rykar's decision when she couldn't even make sense of it herself? "Sometimes people make choices we don't understand," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean we stop being strong. You and I will take care of each other. We'll be okay." The little girl nodded, though it was clear she didn't fully grasp the weight of her mother's words. She wrapped her small arms around Elena's neck, and for a moment the alien woman allowed herself the luxury of holding her daughter close, drawing comfort from the warmth of her touch. But the moment was fleeting. Elena couldn't afford to be soft, not now. Not when the Zemerian government's eyes were everywhere, hunting for remnants of the failed rebellion. Rykar's name would soon be on their lips, and by association hers and Lyra's too. She pulled back and took a deep breath, steeling herself. "We have to go, Lyra. We can't stay here any longer." "Where are we going?" Elena didn't have an answer. The universe was vast, and there were just 2 small specks in its endless expanse. But she knew that anywhere would be better than here, where the walls seemed to close in tighter every day, where the air was thick with the promise of violence and retribution. "I've found someone who can help us," she said, though the words tasted bitter in her mouth. Help. It felt more like a gamble, one that could cost them their lives. The smugglers she had contacted were a last resort. Shady characters who operated in the underbelly of Zymeria, offering passage off-world for a price that was never as simple as currency. She'd met with one of their brokers in a dimly lit corner of the city's underground, a place where the stench of desperation hung in the air as thick as the smog. They'd promised her passage to a neutral system, far from Zymeria and its war-torn ruins. Somewhere where she and Lyra could start fresh, unnoticed by the Zymerian authorities or Rykar's enemies. Of course Elena knew they were liars, thieves. But what choice did she have? She had no ship, no connections, and time was running out. They would come for her sooner rather than later. "Are they nice people?" Lyra asked, her voice laced with a childlike innocence that Elena couldn't bear to shatter. "They'll get us where we need to go," Elena replied, dodging the truth. She gently guided Lyra to the small pack she had prepared for her, filled with the essentials: clothing, food rations, a few precious items from their old life. "Come, help me carry these." Together they moved quickly through the desolate apartment, a shell of what had once been a home. The walls were bare, stripped of any personal items. There was nothing left that connected them to this place, save for the ghost of Rykar that lingered in every corner. As they stepped outside, the cold wind cut through Elena's thin cloak, but she barely felt it. Her mind was focused, calculating every step toward survival. They made their way through the narrow alleyways of the city. Avoiding the main streets where patrols of Zymerian enforcers prowled, their sleek black uniforms a chilling reminder of the regime's reach. Elena kept her telepathic abilities attuned, scanning the emotions of those around them, searching for any sign of danger. The rendezvous point with the smugglers was hidden in the depths of the city's underbelly, a labyrinth of tunnels and forgotten passageways beneath the surface. It was a place where the desperate and the lawless mingled, far from the eyes of authority. The stench of rot and decay clung to the air as they descended deeper into the gloom, and Elena tightened her grip on Lyra's hand. Finally, they reached the meeting point, an old hangar, its doors rusted and half-closed, barely holding together. The smuggler's ship, a beat-up freighter with scorch marks across its hull, sat ominously in the center of the room. Elena's stomach twisted at the sight, but she pushed the fear down. A tall, wiry figure emerged from the shadows. His skin was pale, almost translucent under the flickering lights, and his eyes glinted with a predatory intelligence. "You're late," he rasped, his voice like gravel scraping over metal. Elena squared her shoulders, masking her unease. "We're here. That's all that matters." The smuggler's eyes flicked toward Lyra, and Elena instinctively stepped in front of her daughter, her body tense. "You have what we agreed on." He smiled a sharp, thin smile that sent a shiver down Elena's spine. "Of course. Passage to the next system, just like we promised." She didn't trust him. But what choice did she have? With a nod, Elena handed over the last of the credits she had scavenged. The smuggler took them, counting the coins slowly, deliberately, before pocketing them. "Board the ship," he said, jerking his head toward the freighter. "We leave in 5 minutes." Elena guided Lyra up the ramp, her heart pounding. As they entered the dimly lit interior, the smell of oil and old metal filled the air. The ship was as shabby on the inside as it was on the outside. It didn't inspire confidence, but Elena forced herself to focus on the goal. They were leaving Zymeria. That was what mattered. Once inside, she found a small corner where she and Lyra could sit, away from the leering eyes of the smuggler's crew. She wrapped an arm around her daughter, who was quiet but wide-eyed, taking in her surroundings with a mix of curiosity and fear. Elena whispered soothing words to her, though her mind was a whirlwind of doubt. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cold darkness of space stretched out endlessly before them, a vast, empty void that seemed to swallow the small freighter whole. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound, vibrating through the metal walls with a low, ominous thrum. Inside, Elena sat perfectly still, her arms wrapped protectively around Lyra, who lay curled against her mother's side, fast asleep. But Elena could not rest. The nagging sense of doom that had gripped her since the moment they left Zymeria had only grown stronger. Every instinct told her that something was terribly wrong, that they were being led into a trap. She had tried to calm herself, to remind herself that this was simply the paranoia that came from years of surviving under an oppressive regime, yet the thought would not leave her. She scanned the ship's cramped, dimly lit cargo hold, her sharp alien eyes picking up every detail: the exposed wires running along the walls, the flickering lights, the smell of old metal and stale air. The place reeked of neglect, much like the smuggler crew itself. Most of them had retreated to the front of the ship, leaving Elena and Lyra in the hold with little more than the hum of the engines and the distant murmurs of low voices to accompany them. The freighter's course, however, remained an enigma to Elena. She had no access to the ship's navigation systems, and when she reached out telepathically, all she could sense from the crew were vague feelings of greed, impatience, and something more sinister lurking beneath their surface thought, something she didn't dare probe too deeply. The thought of being lost in space, of being abandoned in some desolate corner of the galaxy, gnawed at her. She'd heard stories of smugglers like these, of how they lured desperate souls with promises of safe passage only to rob them and leave them to die in the cold vacuum of space. Elena knew she was out of options. If she didn't act soon, they could both be doomed. A soft murmur from Lyra pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. Her daughter stirred against her, her tiny body shifting restlessly in sleep. Even unconscious, Lyra's psychic abilities were sensitive. She could pick up on her mother's anxiety, even if she didn't fully understand it. Elena brushed a hand through Lyra's silvery hair, willing herself to be calm for her daughter's sake. "Stay strong, Elena," she told herself. "You've survived worse than this." But in truth, the isolation was wearing on her. They were no longer on solid ground, no longer bound to anything familiar. Out here, in the infinite expanse of space, she felt powerless adrift, just like their ship. Her heart ached with the weight of responsibility. It was up to her alone to protect Lyra. There would be no one coming to save them, no allies hidden in the shadows. They were on their own. Suddenly, the ship gave a sharp lurch, jolting Elena out of her reverie. Lyra woke with a startled gasp, her wide eyes searching her mother's face for reassurance. "Mama, what's happening?" Lyra's voice was small, frightened. She clutched her mother's cloak tightly, as though afraid she might slip away. Elena's stomach dropped. She could feel that the ship's engines were failing. The steady thrum that had vibrated through the walls had grown erratic, sputtering in an unnatural rhythm. Panic flared within her, but she forced it down, her mind racing through the possibilities. "Stay close to me," Lyra Elena whispered, her voice calm but firm. "I'm going to find out." She rose to her feet, steadying herself against the wall as the ship jerked again. Lyra clung to her hand, following closely as they made their way to the small viewport at the edge of the cargo hold. Through the scratched glass, Elena could see nothing but the cold, starless void. No planets, no ships, no light, just endless darkness. And then the ship's engines cut out entirely. The sudden silence was deafening. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the hold into pitch-black darkness. Mama, Lyra cried out, her grip tightening on Elena's hand. "I'm here, Lyra. Don't be afraid." Elena knelt down, pulling her daughter close. She could feel Lyra trembling against her, and she wished more than anything that she could offer her some real comfort, some certainty. But in truth, Elena was just as scared. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, and her mind raced, trying to grasp onto any plan of action. The darkness pressed in around them like a physical weight. Without the hum of the engines, the ship felt eerily still, as though it were already a drifting ghost in the emptiness of space. Elena's thoughts leaped to the worst-case scenarios. If the engines were truly dead, they could be stranded for days, weeks, possibly forever. The freighter wasn't equipped with any advanced navigation or communication technology, and even if it had been, Elena knew the smugglers wouldn't have cared enough to use it for her and Lyra's sake. The crew had already retreated to the ship's upper levels, and she doubted they'd be of any help now. If this is a trap, they've sprung it perfectly, Elena thought grimly. Her body was taut, every muscle coiled in readiness. She had to stay alert, stay focused. They were alone in the dark, but she wasn't powerless. "I need to check something, Lyra." "Stay here, just for a moment." No, Lyra's voice was full of raw fear, her psychic connection with Elena amplifying her emotions. "Don't leave me, Mama, please." Elena hesitated. She didn't want to leave Lyra for even a moment, not when the ship felt like a floating tomb. But she needed to understand what was happening. Without that knowledge, they were completely vulnerable. "All right, sweet one," Elena murmured, her voice softening. "You'll come with me, but stay close." They moved through the narrow corridor leading to the ship's central cabin, the air growing colder with each step. The emergency lighting, a dull red glow, flickered to life sporadically, casting long shadows against the walls. Elena strained her senses, reaching out with her telepathy, scanning for any sign of the crew or an imminent threat. But all she could feel was an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the ship itself had become a living entity, a dark, malevolent force that was swallowing them whole. As they reached the control room, the door slid open with a hiss, revealing the cockpit bathed in a pale, ghostly light from the few functional monitors. Two of the smugglers were huddled over the controls, their voices low and tense. Elena stayed hidden just outside the doorway, listening closely. "It's not supposed to be like this," one of them muttered, his voice thick with panic. "We're drifting. The coordinates are all messed up." The other smuggler growled, slamming his fist against the console. "Someone sabotaged the engines. We're losing power faster than we should be." Sabotage. Elena's breath caught in her throat. They hadn't just planned to abandon her, they'd rigged the ship to fail, to leave them stranded in space without a chance of survival. She withdrew into the shadows before they could spot her, her mind racing. They couldn't stay on this ship. They had to find a way off, or else they'd die here, trapped in the endless cold. "We need to find a way out," she whispered to Lyra. Her daughter's wide eyes gleamed in the dim light, full of trust and fear. "But how, Mama?" "There's nowhere to go. We'll figure it out. I promise." Elena moved quickly, her thoughts turning toward the ship's escape pods. Every freighter, no matter how old or poorly maintained, had to have them. It was a long shot, but if they could reach one before the smugglers realized what she was planning, they might have a chance. She had to hope the pods were still functional and that they had enough fuel to get them somewhere safe. She guided Lyra through the ship's labyrinth of narrow corridors, the emergency lights flickering and sputtering as they passed. The smell of burning circuitry hung in the air, a stark reminder that the freighter was falling apart around them. Elena's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. She couldn't afford to panic, not now. They reached the escape pod bay, tucked away near the rear of the ship. The door slid open with a groan, and Elena's heart sank at the sight before her. Of the 3 pods, 2 were already missing, likely jettisoned by the crew in their panic. Only one remained, its hatch sealed shut and covered in dust. Elena hurried to the pod, her fingers flying over the console as she initiated the launch sequence. The screen flickered to life, showing a bleak assessment: minimal fuel, navigation offline, but the pod was still functional. It was their only chance. "Get inside," Lyra Elena urged. The little girl hesitated for a moment, her small hands trembling, but she did as her mother said, climbing into the pod. Elena followed, sealing the hatch behind them. The pod's interior was cramped, barely big enough for the 2 of them. Elena strapped Lyra into one of the safety harnesses, her hands shaking slightly as she buckled her own. "Hold on tight," Elena said softly, brushing a hand over Lyra's head. "We're going to be okay." She hit the launch button, and the pod shuddered violently before being ejected from the freighter into the cold expanse of space. The force of the launch pressed them back against their seats, and Lyra gasped, her tiny hands gripping Elena's arm. For a long moment, all Elena could hear was the pounding of her own heart and the hum of the pod's systems. Outside, through the small viewport, space yawned before them, black, empty, and indifferent. The freighter was already a distant speck in the void, a broken husk of metal lost in the endless darkness. But they were free. Elena's chest tightened with a mix of relief and dread. They had escaped the freighter, but now what? The pod had no navigation, no way of knowing where they were or how to get to safety. For all she knew, they were drifting aimlessly, just like before, lost in the infinite void of space. She glanced down at Lyra, who had curled up in her seat, her eyes wide and fearful but filled with a quiet, unshakable trust in her mother. "What happens now, Mama?" she whispered, her voice so soft it was barely audible over the hum of the pod's engines. Elena swallowed hard, her mind racing. She didn't have an answer. She had no idea what would happen now. All she knew was that she had to keep them alive, somehow. "I don't know," Lyra, she admitted softly, her voice tight with emotion. "But we're going to keep going. We'll find a way." Hours passed, then days. The pod floated silently through the vast emptiness, its limited rations dwindling as time dragged on. Elena kept a close eye on Lyra, making sure she stayed hydrated and as comfortable as possible, but the girl was growing weaker, her psychic abilities dimming as her energy faded. Elena's heart ached as she watched her daughter struggle to stay strong. Every moment spent adrift in the void felt like an eternity. The isolation was maddening, the silence oppressive. She had no idea how much longer they could hold on. And then, just as hope was beginning to slip away, a flicker of light appeared on the pod's scanner ship. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Was it real? Could it be? She reached out with her mind, sending a desperate, silent plea into the void, praying that whoever was out there would hear her. And they did. The ship drew closer, its silhouette massive and unfamiliar, but unmistakably human. Alina's heart raced as she felt the unmistakable presence of another mind reaching back, faint but clear. Rescue had come. But who had found them? And what would come next? The answers to those questions, Alina knew, would change everything. The human vessel loomed ahead like a ghostly giant in the darkness. Its metallic surface shimmered faintly, illuminated by distant starlight. Alina's heart thudded in her chest as the pod's sensors began to ping rhythmically, signaling the proximity of the ship. Each beep was a reminder that help or something else entirely was closing in. She glanced at Lyra, whose eyes were wide with wonder, her small hands gripping the edges of her seat. The child's exhaustion from days of drifting had momentarily lifted, replaced by cautious curiosity. But even in her innocent gaze, Alina could feel the anxiety building, a reflection of her own emotions. The ship, larger than anything Alina had ever seen, grew closer, its hull a monolith of human engineering, angular and efficient. It was far from the sleek, organic designs of Zamarian vessels, which seemed to meld with the natural elements of their homeworld. This ship, by contrast, was all steel and iron, an imposing beast that cut through the vacuum of space with the brute force of a species determined to conquer it. Alina's breath caught as a soft, unfamiliar voice crackled through the pod's intercom, speaking in a language she didn't fully understand, but whose intent was clear. "This is Captain Jack Harper of the Vanguard. We've received your distress signal. Preparing to dock." The relief was so sudden and overwhelming that Alina had to fight back tears. The words, though foreign, carried a tone of authority and kindness. It wasn't the cold, calculating voice of a smuggler or a Zamarian enforcer. It was human. But even in her relief, Alina was cautious. They had been betrayed once before, and out here, in the vast emptiness of space, she had learned that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Yet they had no other option. Without help, she and Lyra would perish, lost forever in the cold, unfeeling void. The docking process was smooth but tense. As the pod shuddered to a halt within the ship's docking bay, Alina's muscles tensed. She could hear the faint hiss of the airlock pressurizing, followed by the metallic clang of the door mechanisms releasing. Her eyes darted around the small escape pod, seeking any last-minute method of defense, but there was nothing. They had used up what little resources they had left in their escape from the freighter. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a figure standing in the threshold. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark flight suit that bore the insignia of the Vanguard. His face was weathered, lined with years of experience, and his eyes a sharp, piercing blue studied her with an intensity that made her hold her breath. His hair was dark, streaked with silver at the temples, and his expression, though hard at first glance, softened when he saw Lyra clinging to her mother's side. Alina could sense his thoughts, feel the emotions radiating from him: curiosity, caution, and above all, an unexpected wave of compassion. His mind was open, not in the way Zymerians communicated telepathically, but in the way humans often wore their emotions just beneath the surface, raw and visible for those who knew how to look. Jack Harper took a slow step forward, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe now." His voice, rich and deep, filled the small space. Alina could understand him now, his words less garbled than they had been over the intercom. The universal translator embedded in the pod was finally working its way through the language barrier, piecing together his dialect. She straightened, forcing herself to appear calm and in control, even though every instinct screamed at her to stay on guard. Lyra's small hand tightened around Alina's cloak, her eyes wide and uncertain as she peered at the stranger. Jack glanced at the little girl and gave her a reassuring smile. "You must be Lyra," he said softly. His gaze flicked back to Alina. "And you're her mother, I assume." Alina nodded, still not trusting her voice, still not sure what to make of this human. She could sense his sincerity, but her mind was conditioned to doubt, to question, to anticipate betrayal. Jack took another step forward, stopping just short of the doorway. "You've been through a lot. I'm not going to push you for answers right now. Let's get you both aboard, get you some food, water, and rest." The promise of food and water, of anything other than the cold emptiness they had endured for days, tempted Elena more than she wanted to admit. But she had to be careful. She couldn't show weakness. We were abandoned, she said, her voice low and measured. She hated how vulnerable it sounded. Our ship malfunctioned, and we've been drifting. Jack's gaze lingered on her for a long moment, as if weighing her words, but there was no judgment in his expression. Instead, there was only concern. Then it's good we found you, he said, his voice steady. Come on, let's get you out of here. Elena hesitated for only a fraction of a second before she slowly stood, guiding Lyra to her feet. The little girl, though scared, stayed close to her mother's side, her eyes never leaving Jack. The docking bay was a cavernous space, dimly lit and utilitarian. Large crates and equipment were stacked along the walls, and the distant hum of the ship's engines reverberated through the metal floor. As they stepped out of the pod, Jack gestured toward a small lift at the far end of the bay. This'll take us to the main deck, he said, his tone casual but not dismissive. I've got some rations in the galley. You two look like you could use a meal. Elena's stomach growled involuntarily at the mention of food, and she felt a flush of embarrassment rise to her cheeks. It had been days since she'd eaten anything substantial, rationing what little they had for Lyra's sake. She kept her expression neutral, but she knew Jack had noticed. As they rode the lift in silence, Elena studied him closely, trying to understand this human. He was unlike the smugglers. There was no trace of greed or deception in his thoughts. Instead, she felt the weariness of a man who had seen too much, carried too many burdens, but who still held on to some core of decency that surprised her. When the lift doors opened, they stepped into the ship's main corridor. It was clean and well-maintained, though not luxurious. The walls were lined with utility panels and consoles, and the soft glow of overhead lights created a sense of calm that Elena found strangely comforting. Jack led them to the galley, a small but functional space with a table, chairs, and a modest kitchen setup. He moved with efficiency, retrieving 2 ration packs and setting them down in front of Elena and Lyra. Not exactly gourmet, he said with a small smile, but it'll fill you up. Elena eyed the food cautiously, then tore open the pack. The smell of rehydrated protein and grains was far from appetizing, but hunger gnawed at her, and she began eating in small, measured bites, careful not to show too much eagerness. Lyra, on the other hand, dove into her meal with the ravenous energy of a child who had gone far too long without proper sustenance. Jack watched her with a faint smile, his eyes softening as the little girl devoured the food. She's strong, he said, his voice quiet. Takes after you, I imagine. Elena looked up sharply, meeting his gaze. There was no malice in his words, no manipulation, just an observation. She felt a pang of something she hadn't expected: gratitude. It was a dangerous feeling, one she couldn't afford right now. Trusting too quickly had been her downfall before. She is strong, Elena replied, her voice guarded. She has to be. Jack leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He didn't push her for more, didn't pry into her past. Instead, he shifted the conversation to lighter topics, asking about Zymeria's weather, its seasons, and how their society worked. His curiosity was genuine, though he treaded carefully, never probing too deeply. Elena answered in short, clipped sentences, still unsure of how much she should reveal. She knew that Lyra's psychic abilities would draw interest, and the last thing she wanted was to make her daughter a target. But the more Jack spoke, the more she found herself lowering her guard just slightly. There was something about him, something solid, dependable. He didn't seem to be looking for anything from her, other than basic human connection. As they talked, Lyra began to doze off, her small body slumping against Elena's side. Jack noticed and stood, gesturing toward the corridor. I've got an extra cabin down the hall, he said. It's not much, but it'll give you both a place to rest. Elena hesitated. The thought of leaving the safety of the galley, even for a few hours of sleep, made her uneasy. She wasn't used to trusting anyone, especially not a stranger, especially not a human. But exhaustion weighed on her, and Lyra's breathing had already deepened into sleep. They couldn't keep going like this without rest. Finally, Elena nodded. Thank you. Jack led them to the cabin, a small but comfortable space with 2 narrow bunks, a wash station, and a viewport that looked out into the vast expanse of space. Elena laid Lyra down on the lower bunk, covering her with a thin blanket, as the little girl sighed contentedly in her sleep. Jack lingered at the doorway, his arms crossed, watching with an unreadable expression. "If you need anything, just call. I'll be on the bridge." Elena didn't reply, but she gave him a curt nod as he left the room, the door sliding shut behind him with a soft hiss. For a long moment she stood in the center of the room, staring down at her sleeping daughter. Lyra's small face was peaceful, her breathing steady, and for the first time in days, Elena allowed herself to feel the weight of her own exhaustion. But sleep didn't come easily. Even as she lay down on the bunk, her body heavy with fatigue, her mind raced with thoughts of everything that had happened, of everything that could happen. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly safe, that something more was waiting for them just beyond the horizon. And yet, Jack Harper didn't seem like a threat. She had reached out with her telepathy, just briefly, to test his emotions, and all she had sensed was kindness, a protective instinct. His mind was guarded, yes, likely the result of years spent alone in space, but there was no malice there, no hidden agenda. Still, she couldn't afford to be complacent. Hours passed. Elena drifted in and out of a fitful sleep, her dreams filled with fragments of her past, of Zamiria, of Rykar, of the life she had once imagined for herself and her family. But every time she reached out for those memories, they crumbled, replaced by the cold emptiness of space and the uncertainty of the future. She woke with a start, her heart racing, unsure of how much time had passed. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the ship's engines. Lyra was still asleep, her small body curled beneath the blanket. Elena swung her legs over the edge of the bunk, her bare feet touching the cold floor. She stood and walked to the viewport, gazing out at the endless stars beyond. What happens next? The question lingered in her mind, heavy with uncertainty. But for the first time in a long while she felt a glimmer of something else. Hope. Morning, or what passed for morning on a ship adrift in the void of space, came with a soft chime from the ship's intercom. Elena blinked awake, her senses immediately alert. Lyra was still curled up on the bunk, her breathing soft and even. Elena allowed herself a moment to take in the peaceful sight before she rose and made her way to the door. The corridor outside was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the ship's lights. Elena moved cautiously, her footsteps nearly silent as she made her way toward the bridge. As she neared the door, she could hear the low murmur of Jack's voice, speaking to someone over the ship's comm system. She hesitated at the threshold, not wanting to intrude, but curiosity got the better of her. She stepped closer, listening. Yeah, I've got them both aboard," Jack was saying. His tone was steady, but there was a faint undercurrent of tension. "We're still in the outer sectors, no sign of trouble yet, but I don't know where they're from or who might be looking for them." Elena's heart skipped a beat. She pressed herself against the wall, listening intently. "I'll bring them back to Earth," Jack continued. "But I need more information. If they're on the run, I need to know what kind of heat they're bringing with them." Silence followed, and Elena's mind raced. Was Jack planning to turn them over to someone? Had he already made contact with the authorities? Her trust, fragile as it was, began to crack. She knew she had to confront him. Taking a deep breath, Elena stepped forward, the door sliding open as she entered the bridge. Jack looked up, surprised but not startled. "You're awake," he said, his tone neutral. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Come, sit." Elena didn't move. Her gaze locked onto his, searching for answers. "Who were you speaking to just now?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "My contact back on Earth. I had to let them know I found you. They'll want to know if I'm bringing anyone with me." "And what did you tell them?" Elena's voice was sharper than she intended. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I told them I found 2 survivors, a mother and her daughter, lost in space. That's all." "That's all." Elena crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "What happens when we get to Earth? Will they be waiting to take us away?" Jack's gaze softened, and he shook his head. "No one's taking you anywhere. You're not prisoners, Elena. I'm not turning you over to anyone. But I need to know who's after you. I can't help you if I don't know the full story." Elena hesitated, her instincts telling her to keep her guard up, but something in Jack's voice, in the quiet sincerity of his words, made her pause. He wasn't trying to manipulate her. He was trying to understand. Slowly, she uncrossed her arms and sat down in the chair beside him. "I'm not sure I can trust you," she admitted quietly. "But I don't have a choice." Jack nodded, understanding. "No, you don't. But I can promise you this: no harm will come to you or your daughter while you're on this ship. I'll make sure of it." For the first time since they had boarded the Vanguard, Elena felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: the beginnings of trust. As the days passed, a tentative rhythm settled between them. Jack kept to his duties, navigating the ship through the uncharted regions of space, while Elena watched over Lyra, who had grown more comfortable in their new surroundings. The little girl had taken a liking to Jack, often watching him from the doorway of the bridge as he worked, her curiosity piqued by the strange new technology of the human vessel. Jack, for his part, was patient with her, answering her questions with a soft smile, explaining the functions of the ship in terms she could understand. Elena watched their interactions carefully, always on alert, but slowly she found herself easing into the routine. The ship was quiet, the vastness of space surrounding them like a protective cocoon. And though Elena knew that danger still lurked somewhere in the shadows, for the first time since they had fled Zymeria, she felt a sense of safety. It was fragile, this newfound trust, but it was there. And as they drew closer to Earth, Elena began to wonder if, perhaps, they had found something more than just safety. Perhaps, in the most unlikely of places, they had found an ally. Perhaps, even, they had found a home. But what lay ahead, Elena knew, was still uncertain. The Vanguard sailed through the cold, silent void, each day bringing them closer to Earth, a world Elena had never imagined setting foot on. Though the ship's artificial day and night cycles regulated time, the passage of hours felt warped in the vastness of space. Out here, isolated from any known system, time seemed irrelevant. And yet, there was a quiet urgency thrumming beneath the surface of their journey, a tension that neither Elena nor Jack spoke aloud. Elena spent much of her time in the small cabin she shared with Lyra, their temporary sanctuary aboard the human ship. She tried to focus on keeping Lyra engaged, teaching her simple exercises to hone her telepathic abilities, but her mind often wandered. Every minute that passed brought her closer to Earth, and though Jack had assured her they would be safe there, doubt gnawed at her. She was an outsider. No matter how kind Jack had been, no matter how much Lyra had warmed to him, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that Earth would be different, alien. Would they truly find a home there? Would she and her daughter be welcomed, or would they be seen as interlopers, fugitives from a distant, war-torn world? And then there was Jack. The more time she spent around him, the more she found herself drawn into his quiet, steadfast presence. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He had taken them in, offered them shelter, food, and protection without asking for anything in return. It was more than she had ever expected from a stranger, let alone a human. And yet, there was something in his eyes, a depth of loss and loneliness, that mirrored her own. He was kind to Lyra in a way that surprised Elena, never patronizing, always patient. It was a softness she hadn't anticipated from someone who had clearly spent much of his life in the unforgiving frontier of space. But Jack's gentleness came with an unspoken pain, a wound that hadn't healed, though Elena couldn't quite tell what had caused it. As she lay awake in the narrow bunk, staring at the dim glow of the overhead lights, Elena's mind drifted back to the quiet moments they had shared in the days since boarding the Vanguard, the easy conversations, the subtle glances. The way Jack had begun to include her in the ship's daily routines as if she were part of its crew. He wasn't like Rykar. That thought came unbidden, sending a pang of guilt through her. She had loved Rykar once, deeply and completely, despite his flaws, despite his growing ambition that had eventually consumed him. But in Jack she saw something different. There was no hunger for power in him, no ulterior motives. His actions were born of a genuine desire to help, to do what was right. And that frightened her. Because if she let herself trust him, if she let herself feel anything more, it would mean opening herself up to the possibility of being hurt again. Lyra stirred beside her, her small body turning in sleep, and Elena reached out, brushing a hand over her daughter's silvery hair. Lyra had adapted more easily than Elena had expected. Though the child still carried the weight of what had happened on Zymeria, she had found a sense of safety in their small, makeshift family aboard the Vanguard. Elena only wished she could share her daughter's optimism. The ship's bridge was quiet when Elena arrived the next morning, Lyra still asleep in their cabin. Jack sat at the helm, his fingers dancing over the controls as he monitored the ship's course. He glanced up as she entered, offering her a small, tired smile. "Good morning," he said, his voice low but warm. "How's Lyra?" "She's fine," Elena replied, moving to stand beside him. "Still sleeping?" Jack nodded, his gaze returning to the view beyond the viewport. The stars stretched out before them like a glittering ocean, the blackness of space endless and vast. For a moment, they stood in silence, the only sound the soft hum of the ship's engines. Elena found herself watching him, studying the lines of his face, the way his eyes seemed to reflect the emptiness of the stars beyond. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers, refugees, and survivors. It was the look of someone who had lost something, someone who had been carrying the weight of that loss for far too long. "How long until we reach Earth?" she asked, breaking the silence. 3 more days, Jack replied, his voice distant. "Maybe less if we can push the engines a bit harder." Elena nodded, though the thought of Earth filled her with unease. "And when we arrive, what then?" Jack's hand stilled on the controls, and he turned to face her fully. His expression was serious, but there was a softness in his eyes that caught her off guard. "I'll take you to the United Earth Council. They're cautious, but they've dealt with refugees before. They'll help you get settled, find a place for you and Lyra. You won't be alone." The promise of safety should have comforted her, but Elena felt a knot of tension tighten in her chest. And if they don't want us? If they see us as a threat? Jack's gaze didn't waver. "I won't let that happen. I'll vouch for you. You're not a threat, Elena. You're just trying to survive." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled deep in her chest. For the first time in a long while, Elena felt the sting of tears behind her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, unwilling to show that vulnerability. "Why?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you helping us?" Jack looked down, his expression flickering with something unspoken regret, perhaps, or guilt. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost fragile. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything. I know what it's like to be alone, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone." Elena's breath hitched in her throat. She hadn't expected such honesty, such rawness. There was a depth to Jack's pain that mirrored her own, a depth that made her want to reach out to him, to close the distance between them. But she couldn't. Not yet. Instead, she nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the shared grief that bound them, even if neither of them was ready to face it. The days passed quietly, the steady hum of the ship's engines lulling Elena into a false sense of calm. She and Jack spoke more often, the silences between them no longer filled with tension, but with an unspoken understanding. Lyra had become attached to Jack, following him around the ship with wide-eyed curiosity, asking questions about the stars and the systems they passed. Jack answered her with the patience of someone who had once loved a child deeply. But even as Elena began to trust Jack more, a creeping anxiety settled into her bones. The closer they got to Earth, the more the weight of their situation pressed down on her. She hadn't told Jack everything, not about Rykar, not about why they were truly running. And though she trusted him more than anyone she had since leaving Zemeria, she wasn't ready to reveal the full truth. One night, as Lyra slept soundly in their cabin, Elena found herself standing outside the bridge, her hand hovering over the door panel. She had heard Jack's voice earlier, speaking to someone on a secure channel, and though she didn't want to eavesdrop, the words had unsettled her. "They'll want to know who they are," Jack had said quietly, his tone serious. "I'll do what I can, but I can't make promises." Who was he talking to? And what promises could he not keep? Elena pressed her palm to the door panel, and it slid open with a soft hiss. Jack was standing at the viewport, his back to her, his posture tense. He didn't turn as she entered, but she knew he had sensed her presence. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. Elena stepped closer, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I heard you earlier. Who were you talking to?" Jack sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. He didn't answer right away, and Elena felt a flicker of dread crawl up her spine. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was hard, but not unkind. "I was talking to my contact with the Earth Council," he said. They need to know what to expect when we arrive." Elena's heart raced. "And what did you tell them?" "Only what I know," Jack replied, his voice steady. "That you're a mother trying to protect her daughter, that you've been through hell and you deserve a chance to start over. But they're cautious, Elena. They have to be." The days since their arrival on Earth passed in a blur of uncertainty and cautious hope. The Earth Council's temporary safe house, a modest, two-room apartment nestled in the heart of a sprawling city, had become a sanctuary for Elena and Lyra. Outside, Earth hummed with life, a cacophony of sounds and sensations that both fascinated and overwhelmed Elena. She had never experienced a planet so alive. The air was rich with the scent of vegetation, the gentle hum of distant traffic, and the chatter of humans moving through their daily routines. It was nothing like Zemiria's desolate landscapes, where the air always carried the faint scent of burning and decay, and the only sounds were those of war. For Lyra, Earth was a wonderland. The little girl's eyes had lit up the moment they had stepped out of the spaceport and into the bustling city, her telepathic senses alive with the surge of human emotions around them. There was joy, curiosity, and kindness, but also fear and suspicion, lingering on the edges of her mind like dark clouds. Elena could sense it too. Earth wasn't entirely safe. There was tension beneath the surface, and though they had been welcomed, they were still outsiders in a world that had its own struggles. The officials from the Earth Council had been cautious but kind. They had asked Elena a series of probing questions about her past, about Zemiria, and about what had led her to flee with her daughter. She had answered as truthfully as she could, though she kept certain details about Rykar and the rebellion close to her chest. Trusting humans with the full extent of her story would come in time, but for now she needed to protect Lyra from the dangers of their past. Jack Harper had stayed by her side through it all, his presence a quiet comfort. He had vouched for her and Lyra, navigating the Earth Council's bureaucratic processes with a calm, steady hand. His reputation as an explorer and cartographer carried weight with the authorities, and Elena knew that without him, their journey might have ended very differently. It was strange, she thought, how quickly her life had changed. Only weeks ago, she had been lost in the cold, endless expanse of space, drifting with no hope, no future. And now here she was on Earth, with a roof over her head, food in her stomach, and a growing sense of stability. Yet, even with all this, Elena couldn't fully relax. The shadow of her past loomed large, and the unknown fate of Rykar haunted her. She sat by the window of their small apartment, watching as the city below pulsed with life. Humans walked the streets in small groups, their conversations too distant to hear but filled with the warmth of normalcy. The view was so different from the stark, sterile architecture of Zemiria. Here buildings were alive with greenery, with colorful murals painted on walls and open markets bustling with people. It was a world that embraced life, not one consumed by war. Lyra was playing quietly on the floor, her telepathic abilities manifesting as she moved small objects with her mind, little trinkets they had been given when they arrived. She had been practicing under Elena's watchful eye, honing her natural abilities in ways that made her mother both proud and anxious. The power in Lyra was growing, and Elena knew it was only a matter of time before someone on Earth noticed. "Mama, look," Lyra said, her voice bright with excitement as she made a small wooden figure levitate and spin in the air. Elena smiled, her heart swelling with love and pride. "You're getting stronger every day, sweet one." Lyra beamed, her eyes shimmering with joy, but there was a hint of curiosity behind them. "Do humans have powers like me?" Elena shook her head, her smile fading slightly. "No, humans aren't like us. But that doesn't make them any less special. They have their own strengths."
Lyra considered this for a moment, her small brow furrowing in concentration as she lowered the wooden figure back to the ground. "Jack is strong," she said thoughtfully. "He doesn't need powers."
Elena's heart tightened at the mention of Jack. He had become such a central part of their lives so quickly, and it both comforted and frightened her. She couldn't deny that she felt something for him, a connection that went deeper than mere gratitude. He had saved them, yes, but it was more than that. His quiet presence, his unshakable sense of responsibility, and his kindness had stirred something in her that she hadn't felt in years. But with those feelings came fear, the fear of losing him, the fear of opening herself up to someone again. As if summoned by her thoughts, the door to the apartment slid open with a soft hiss, and Jack stepped inside. He was dressed in his usual dark flight suit, his hair slightly disheveled from the wind outside. His face was set in that familiar expression of calm resolve, though Elena could see the weariness behind his eyes. "Everything all right?" Elena asked, standing as he entered. Jack nodded, though his expression was more serious than usual. "The council's given the green light for you and Lyra to stay. They're working on finding a more permanent place for you, but for now this safe house is yours." Elena exhaled, the weight of uncertainty lifting just slightly. "That's good news, thank you." Jack met her gaze, his blue eyes steady. "I told you I'd take care of it." She nodded, feeling a warmth bloom in her chest. Jack had kept every promise he'd made to her, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this, more to him. There was something he wasn't telling her, something that lingered in the way he looked at her, in the way his voice softened when he spoke to Lyra. As if reading her thoughts, Jack shifted, his expression hardening slightly. "There's something else," he said, his tone cautious. Elena's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Jack glanced at Lyra, who was still playing quietly with her toys, her mind focused on making the small objects move. He lowered his voice. "The council's worried. They've been picking up chatter about Zymeria, about the rebellion. They think there might be people looking for you." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She had known this moment would come. Rykar's enemies wouldn't stop at Zymeria, they would hunt her down across the galaxy if it meant tying up loose ends. And if they found her on Earth... "Who?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know yet," Jack said, his expression grave. "But we need to be careful. You're safe for now, but if anyone from Zymeria tracks you here, the situation could change quickly." Elena's mind raced. She had thought they could find peace here, that Earth would be a refuge where they could start over. But the shadow of her past was longer than she had anticipated, and now it was closing in on them once again. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, his presence a steadying force in the storm of her fear. "We keep a low profile. The council will help, but we can't rely on them for everything. I've got contacts, people I trust. I'll reach out to them, see if we can get more information about what's going on back on Zymeria." Elena nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. She had spent so long running, so long surviving, that the thought of facing another threat, of putting Lyra in danger again, felt unbearable. But Jack was right, they couldn't run forever. They had to face this, whatever it was, and protect what they had built. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jack's hand found hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "We'll get through this. Together. Together." The word sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of fear and hope colliding within her. She had never expected to find someone like Jack, a man who had no reason to help her, no obligation to care, and yet had done so without question. He had become more than just an ally, he was a lifeline, a steady presence that anchored her in the midst of chaos. Their gazes met, and for a moment the weight of everything they had been through seemed to fall away. There was no war, no betrayal, no fear, just the two of them, standing together in the quiet safety of their small apartment. Elena's heart raced, her pulse quickening as she realized how deeply she had come to care for him. "Jack," she began, her voice catching in her throat. But before she could finish, Lyra's voice broke the moment, her excitement bubbling over as she rushed to the window. "Mama. Jack. Look." They turned to see what had captured Lyra's attention. Outside, the sky had darkened, and a soft, silvery light filled the air. Snowflakes, delicate, swirling flakes of white drifted down from the sky, blanketing the city in a layer of shimmering snow. "It's snowing," Lyra cried, her voice filled with awe. She pressed her small hands against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared out at the falling snow. Elena's heart swelled at the sight of her daughter's joy. She had never seen snow before. Zymeria's climate was harsh and dry, a world of barren deserts and ash-filled skies. But here, on Earth, there was beauty. There was life. She turned to Jack, who was watching Lyra with a soft smile on his face. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said quietly, his gaze lingering on Elena. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Yes, it is." For the first time in a long while, Elena allowed herself to hope, to believe that, despite the dangers that still lurked, despite the uncertainties of the future, there was something worth fighting for. There was something worth living for. And as she stood there, watching the snow fall outside, with Jack by her side and Lyra's laughter filling the air, Elena felt a sense of peace settle over her. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. The days that followed were filled with a quiet sense of rebuilding. The Earth Council provided resources to help Elena and Lyra adjust to their new life, offering support and guidance as they navigated the complexities of living on a new planet. There were meetings, documents to sign, and discussions about long-term housing and schooling for Lyra. But through it all, Jack remained a constant presence. He had made Earth his home after years of wandering, and though he had a past he rarely spoke of, Elena could feel the depth of his connection to this place. Earth had given him a second chance, just as it had given her. One evening, as the snow continued to fall outside, Jack invited Elena to the roof of the building, a quiet place where the city's lights seemed distant, almost otherworldly. They stood together, the cold air biting at their skin, but neither of them minded. The city stretched out below them, a sea of lights and life, and above, the stars glittered in the dark sky, a reminder of the vastness they had come from. "I used to come up here a lot," Jack said quietly, his breath visible in the cold air. "After my wife and son died." Elena turned to him, her heart aching at the weight of his words. She had sensed that Jack carried a deep loss, but he had never spoken of it directly. Now here, in the quiet of the night, he was opening up to her in a way that felt both painful and precious. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice filled with empathy. Jack nodded, his gaze distant as he stared out at the horizon. "It was a long time ago, but it still feels like it happened yesterday sometimes. I lost them in an accident out in space. It's why I stayed out there so long. I didn't want to come back. I didn't want to face the reality that they were gone." Elena's heart broke for him. She knew the feeling of loss all too well, of having someone, ripped away without warning. She reached out, gently placing her hand on his arm, offering him the only comfort she could. "You don't have to be alone anymore," she said softly. "Neither of us do." Jack turned to her then, his blue eyes filled with a depth of emotion that took her breath away. For a long moment they stood there, the world around them falling away, leaving only the two of them, connected by their shared grief, their shared survival. And then, before she could second-guess herself, Elena stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. Jack's breath hitched, but he didn't pull away. Slowly, tentatively, she reached up, her fingers brushing the side of his face, and in that moment, everything else faded, every fear, every doubt. They kissed, the cold night air biting at their skin, but the warmth between them was undeniable. It was soft, hesitant at first, but then it deepened, filled with all the emotions they had been holding back for so long. When they finally pulled apart, Elena's heart was racing, her breath shaky. Jack's eyes were wide with a mixture of surprise and affection, and for the first time, Elena felt truly seen, truly understood. As she began, her voice trembling, but Jack shook his head, a small, reassuring smile on his lips. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "I'm here, we're here. That's enough." Elena smiled, her heart light in a way she hadn't felt in years. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder as they stood together, watching the snow fall over the city. For the first time, Elena allowed herself to believe in a future one where she and Lyra could be safe, where they could build a life. And with Jack by her side, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Weeks passed, and slowly, Elena and Lyra began to integrate into Earth's society. Lyra started school, where her psychic abilities were carefully monitored but not suppressed. The Earth Council had decided to treat her gifts with caution but curiosity, understanding that they were part of who she was. Elena found work within the Council's refugee outreach program, helping others who, like her, had fled war-torn planets in search of safety. Life wasn't perfect. There were still moments of fear, still shadows of the past that lingered on the edges of her mind. But there was also peace, a growing sense of belonging that Elena hadn't dared hope for. And then there was Jack. Their relationship deepened in ways Elena hadn't expected. He became not just her protector, but her partner, someone she could lean on, someone who understood her in ways no one else did. Together, they navigated the complexities of their new life, building a future that was both fragile and full of promise. One evening, as they sat together on the couch in their small apartment, Lyra asleep in her room, Elena turned to Jack, her heart full. "I never thought I'd find this," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "Not after everything." Jack smiled, his hand gently squeezing hers. Neither did I. But here we are. Elena leaned into him, her heart light. Here we are. And in that moment, as they sat together, the weight of the galaxy no longer pressing down on them, Elena knew that she had found something more than just survival. She had found a home, a family. And for the first time in a long, long time, she was truly at peace. Weeks passed. Elena stood on the balcony, the cool breeze brushing against her skin as she gazed at the horizon. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the city below. The sky was painted in shades of pink, orange, and purple, reflecting the colors of the emotions swirling inside her. Jack stood beside her, quiet, but his presence was calming, as it always was. Together they watched the sky darken, the city below beginning to light up as the night settled in. "What are you thinking about?" Jack's voice broke the comfortable silence, soft and gentle, yet filled with curiosity. Elena smiled, turning her head slightly to look at him. His face, lit by the soft glow of the fading sun, was thoughtful, and she could see something different in his eyes tonight. Something deeper. "About how much has changed," she said quietly, her smile bittersweet. "I never imagined I'd be here, in a place like this, with Lyra. With you." Jack didn't answer right away, but she could feel his attention on her, feel the weight of his gaze as he studied her face. She turned back to the sunset, her heart beating a little faster, sensing that there was more he wanted to say. "Elena," Jack began, his voice a little lower, filled with an emotion she hadn't heard before. She turned to him, seeing him reach into his jacket pocket, his fingers hesitating for just a moment before pulling out a small box. Her heart skipped a beat. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," Jack said, his voice steady, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes. "You and Lyra. You've changed my life in ways I didn't think were possible. I've spent so long drifting, so long without a home, without a family. But now, I know where I belong." Elena's breath caught in her throat. Jack opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring. The golden band gleamed in the dimming light, and at its center was a small, shimmering stone, catching the last rays of the sun. He looked up at her, his blue eyes soft but filled with determination. "I love you, Elena. I love Lyra. And I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want us to be a family." Elena's heart swelled, emotions overwhelming her. She had never imagined this moment, not after everything they had been through, after everything she had lost. And yet, here it was, right in front of her, this incredible man, offering her a life she hadn't dared hope for. Jack dropped to one knee, still holding the ring, his gaze never leaving hers. "Elena," he said softly, his voice trembling just slightly, "will you marry me?" Tears welled in Elena's eyes. She hadn't expected to feel so much, so deeply. The past, the fear, the uncertainty, they all melted away in that moment, leaving only the pure, undeniable truth of what they had built together. She felt the weight of his words, the sincerity of his love, and knew that this was right. "Yes," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "Yes, Jack." A smile broke across Jack's face, pure, unguarded joy, and he stood, gently taking her hand and slipping the ring onto her finger. Elena felt the warmth of his touch, the solid reassurance of his presence, and her heart soared. Jack pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him as she buried her face in his chest, her tears falling freely now. His arms wrapped around her, strong and protective, and for the first time in a long, long while, Elena felt completely safe, completely loved. When she finally looked up at him, her tears mingled with laughter. Jack smiled down at her, brushing a thumb across her cheek. "We'll make this work, Elena. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Elena nodded, her heart full as she leaned up and pressed her lips to his, a soft, tender kiss that promised everything: love, trust, a future. They stood together on the balcony, wrapped in each other's arms, as the last light of the day disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving them in the quiet embrace of the night. And in that moment, Elena knew this was her new beginning, her second chance at happiness. With Jack and Lyra by her side, she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, truly living, and she couldn't wait to see where this new journey would take them. They had found each other in the vastness of space, and now, together, they had found home.